September 3rd, 1260. A Mamluk general named Bibbers presses his heels into his horse's flanks, urging the animal up a rocky path that winds through the hills of northern Palestine. The morning sun is just breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the Jezreel valley below. When he reaches the summit, he finds Sultan Qutuz waiting with a small guard detachment, their eyes fixed on the valley floor where destiny is about to unfold. Barbars knows what's coming. In a few hours, his small cavalry force will face an enemy that has never been permanently defeated in battle. An enemy that has conquered from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. An enemy that has destroyed kingdoms, burned cities, and left millions dead in their wake. The Mongols are coming and they believe victory is inevitable. But Barbaz has a secret. It's not a secret weapon. It's not superior numbers or better training. The secret lies beneath his horse's feet, in the rocky soil of this ancient land, in the hills that surround this valley, and in something so simple that the Mongols never saw it coming. Today, we're going to tell you the story of how terrain, the ground itself, became the weapon that shattered an empire. This is the story of Ain Jalut, and I can promise you, it's not the story you think you know. Before we dive into one of history's most pivotal battles, I need you to do something for me. If you love stories where underdogs use intelligence over brute force, where geography becomes a character in the drama of history, hit that like button. And if you want more deep dives into the battles that changed everything, subscribe and ring that bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's rewind 2 years to understand just how impossible this victory seemed. In 1258, the city of Baghdad had stood for 500 years as the jewel of the Islamic world. It was home to the House of Wisdom, where scholars from across the known world gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Abbasid Caliphate ruled from this magnificent city, and its caliph was considered the spiritual leader of millions of Muslims from Spain to India. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of books representing centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Then the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led an army estimated at over 100,000 men toward Baghdad's walls. The Caliph al-Mustasim made a catastrophic miscalculation. He believed his city's walls were impregnable. He believed his prestige as the leader of Islam would protect him. He believed perhaps that God would intervene. He was wrong on all counts. When Baghdad fell in February 1258, the Mongols spent a week systematically destroying everything that made it great. They threw so many books into the Tigris River that witnesses said the water ran black with ink. They executed scholars, artists, and scientists. They killed so many people that estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million souls. The Caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses because Mongol superstition forbade spilling royal blood directly on the ground. Think about that for a moment. The center of Islamic civilization, a city that had stood longer than any European capital, was erased in a matter of days. And the Mongols, they moved on as if they had simply checked another box on their to-do list of world conquest. But here's what you need to understand. Baghdad wasn't special. This was standard operating procedure for the Mongol war machine. From 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, until 1260, the Mongols had conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They had defeated the mighty Jin dynasty in China. They had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. They had smashed through Russia like a hammer through glass. They had invaded Poland and Hungary, terrifying all of Europe. A Mongol warrior didn't just ride a horse. He lived on horseback. From the time a Mongol boy could walk, he was learning to ride. By adolescence, he could shoot a bow accurately while riding at full gallop. He could sleep in the saddle. He could navigate by the stars while mounted. The medieval Persian historian Juveni wrote that Mongols were so comfortable on horseback that they appeared to be a single creature like the centaurs of Greek mythology. But here's the real genius of their system. Every Mongol cavalryman brought 3 to 4 horses with him on campaign. Some sources suggest they had as many as 7 remounts each. This meant that while a European knight might ride one exhausted horse, the Mongol was constantly switching to fresh mounts. A Mongol army could cover 60 mi in a single day, twice the distance of a typical medieval army. They could appear where they were thought to be impossible, strike with devastating force, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The Mongol horse itself was perfectly adapted to this lifestyle. Unlike the large European war horses or the sleek Arabian steeds, the Mongol pony was small and stocky, standing only about 4 1/2 ft tall at the shoulder. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in toughness. These horses could survive on minimal fodder, grazing on whatever sparse grass they could find. They could endure temperature extremes from blazing summer heat to 40 degrees, below zero in Siberian winters. They were quite literally the SUVs of the 13th century, built for endurance, not speed or beauty. And here's a detail that sounds almost too bizarre to be true, but is well documented in primary sources. When necessary, a Mongol warrior could make a small incision in his horse's neck, drink some of its blood for nourishment, and then seal the wound and keep riding. The Persian chronicler Malik Javani recorded that a Mongol horseman could ride 10 days without eating cooked food, sustaining himself on horse blood and mare's milk. This eliminated the need for a slow-moving supply train, which meant the Mongol army had no vulnerable baggage to protect and no logistical tails slowing them down. Think about the strategic implications of this. A European army needed to follow roads because it had heavy supply wagons. They needed to stay near cities because they required provisions. They moved slowly, predictably, and could be easily tracked. The Mongols, they could cross deserts, traverse mountains, and appear in places where an army shouldn't be able to exist. They were the closest thing the medieval world had to a modern air cavalry unit. Highly mobile, self-sufficient, and capable of striking anywhere at any time. Their tactics were equally revolutionary. The Mongol army was organized with mathematical precision into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. This decimal system allowed for complex battlefield maneuvers that would have been impossible for the feudal armies of Europe or the Middle East, where knights often fought as individuals, seeking personal glory rather than as coordinated units. A typical Mongol battle strategy went something like this. Light cavalry, armed with powerful composite bows, would harass the enemy from a distance, raining arrows down while staying just out of reach. When the enemy charged to engage, the Mongols would execute their famous feigned retreat. They would turn and flee, appearing to be routed, drawing the enemy into pursuit. The enemy, thinking they had won, would break formation to chase down the fleeing Mongols. And that's when the trap would spring. The retreating Mongols would suddenly wheel around, firing arrows backward from their saddles using a technique called the Parthian shot. Meanwhile, heavy Mongol cavalry hidden nearby would charge into the now disorganized enemy flanks. Mongol horse archers could circle the enemy formation, shooting from all sides while always staying mobile enough to avoid counterattack. It was devastating, and it worked against everyone from Chinese pikemen to European knights to Muslim cavalry. At the Battle of the Kala River in 1223, the Mongols used exactly this tactic against a coalition of Russian princes. The Russians, confident in their superior numbers, pursued what they thought was a defeated Mongol force. The Mongols led them on a 9-day chase across the steppes. By the time the trap closed, the Russian horses were exhausted. Their men were strung out in a vulnerable line of march, and they were far from any support. The Yun Mongols annihilated them. Of the 80,000 Russians who started the battle, only a tiny fraction survived. This psychological warfare was just as important as their military tactics. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared, their populations allowed to live under Mongol rule. Cities that resisted were obliterated, their populations massacred down to the last child, their buildings burned, their fields salted. The Mongols wanted everyone to know that resistance was futile and surrender was the only rational choice. By 1260, this strategy had worked for over 50 years. No one had found a way to permanently stop them. Sure, there had been tactical defeats. The Mongols lost some battles, but they always came back stronger, learned from their mistakes, and ultimately crushed whoever had opposed them. They had defeated every type of enemy, steppe nomads who fought like them, Chinese infantry with advanced siege weapons, European heavy cavalry, and Muslim horse archers. They had proven they could win in every climate and every terrain, from the Siberian tundra to the Iraqi desert. After Baghdad fell, the Mongols turned west into Syria. Damascus, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, opened its gates without a fight in March 1260. The Christian Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia and the Crusader Principality of Antioch had already submitted to Mongol authority and were providing auxiliary troops. The Mongols now controlled everything, from Korea to the Mediterranean Sea, only one major. Muslim power remained, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and the Mongols fully intended to add it to their collection. Now, to understand who the Mamluks were and why they chose to fight rather than surrender, we need to appreciate one of the strangest institutions in medieval Islamic society. The word Mamluk literally means owned or slave in Arabic. The Mamluks were enslaved, boys typically captured from the Turk, peoples of the Central Asian steppes, or from the Caucasus region. These boys, usually between 8 and 12 years old, were purchased by Muslim rulers and brought to Egypt, where they underwent an extraordinary transformation. They were enrolled in what amounted to military mis. For years, sometimes decades, they trained in horseback riding, archery, swordsmanship, and wrestling. They learned to fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They studied tactics and strategy. They memorized the Quran and converted to Islam. They formed bonds with their fellow trainees that would last their entire lives. And here's the twist that seems contradictory to modern ears. Despite being technically enslaved, Mamluks enjoyed high social status. The most talented could rise to become generals, governors, or even sultans. In fact, in 1250, the Mamluks had overthrown their orbit masters in Egypt and established their own sultanate. The wise slaves had become the rulers, but they never forgot where they came from. They never forgot the harsh training, the bonds of brotherhood, and the absolute discipline that had been drilled into them since childhood. In many ways, they were the perfect mirror image of the Mongols, warriors who had grown up on horseback, who understood steppe warfare, who fought as disciplined units rather than glory-seeking individuals. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultan was a man named Qutuz. His story is remarkable in its own right. He had been born a prince in Central Asia, but when the Mongols destroyed his homeland, he was sold into slavery. He worked his way up through the Mamluk system through sheer competence and ruthlessness, eventually seizing power in Egypt in 1259. So, when Hula's envoys arrived in Cairo with a letter demanding Egypt's surrender, this wasn't just a political decision for Qutuz. This was personal. Huligu's letter is worth quoting because it perfectly captures the Mongol psychology of inevitable conquest. It read from the King of Kings of the East and West, the great Khan: "You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. Submit to our orders or face total destruction." Cutout read this letter aloud to his council. Some advisors urged surrender. After all, hadn't everyone else who resisted the Mongols been destroyed? Wasn't submission the only logical choice? Egypt was wealthy? Yes. But could it really stand against the horde that had conquered half the world? Qutuz's response was to have the Mongol envoys executed and their heads mounted on the bob, Zuela Gate of Cairo, for all to see. It was a declaration of war in the most brutal terms possible. There would be no submission, no negotiation, no compromise. Either Egypt would stand or it would fall fighting. Now, this seems like madness, right? This seems like the kind of hot-headed decision that gets entire civilizations destroyed. But Qatus knew something that his advisors didn't fully appreciate. He knew that the Mongols, for all their might, were not at full strength. In 1259, the great Khan Monka died while campaigning in China. This triggered a succession crisis back in Mongolia, and Mongol law required all the royal princes to return to Karakorum to elect the new great Khan, Hulagu. Khan had departed Syria in late Novi 59, taking the bulk of his massive army with him. Some estimates suggest he took over 100,000 men back east. He left behind only a rear guard force under his most trusted general, a Naturian Christian Turk named Kitbuka. Estimates of Kitbuka's force vary wildly in medieval sources, but modern historians believe he had somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Mongol cavalry plus auxiliary troops from Georgia, Armenia and Syria. This was still a formidable army. These were Mongol veterans who had conquered from Baghdad to Damascus, but it was a fraction of the force that had terrified the Muslim world for the past 2 years. Cutout saw his window of opportunity. If he moved fast, he could face Kitbuka's rear guard before Hulagu could return with reinforcements. It was a calculated gamble, but it was the only gamble that offered any hope. He assembled an army of about 20,000 Mamluk cavalry along with auxiliary forces of Bedouin, tribesmen and other volunteers. And then he did something that shows just how desperate and dangerous his position was. He negotiated with the Crusaders. Think about how wild this is. The Mamluks and the Crusaders had been mortal enemies for decades. They had fought countless battles over control of the Holy Land. Just a few years earlier, they would have cheerfully killed each other on sight. But when Qatus's ambassadors approached the Crusader stronghold of Acre, they found the Crusaders were willing to make a deal. Why? Because the Crusaders had come to realize something crucial. The Mongols were a bigger threat than the Muslims. Kitbuka had already sacked the Crusader city of Sidon after a dispute, and the Crusaders understood that if Egypt fell, they would be next. Better to allow the Mamluks passage through Crusader territory than to face the Mongol horde alone. So in July 1260, the Mamluk army marched north through territory controlled by their traditional enemies unmolested. The Crusaders even allowed them to establish supply bases near Acre. It was one of the strangest alliances in medieval history. Born of pure survival instinct, Cutout's army moved into Palestine. And that's where a second key figure enters our story, a Mamluk general named Barbaz. Barbaz is one of the most fascinating characters in medieval history, and I'm frankly amazed he's not better known. In the West, he was born to a Turk family in Central Asia, sold into slavery as a boy, and had risen through the Mamluk ranks to become one of their finest generals. He was also deeply ambitious, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to win. But here's the detail that matters for our story. Years earlier, when Bibars had fallen out of favor with the previous Mamluk Sultan, he had fled Egypt and spent time as a fugitive in Syria and Palestine. He had wandered through the very region where the battle would take place. He knew the terrain. He knew the hills, the valleys, the springs, the narrow passes. He knew where cavalry could maneuver and where they couldn't. He knew the secret that would win the battle. And working together, Qatus and Bibars came up with a plan that would use the Mongols' own tactics against them. Before we get to the battle itself, we need to talk about something that sounds incredibly mundane, but turned out to be absolutely crucial. Horseshoes. I know. You came here for epic cavalry charges and dramatic battlefield heroics, not a discussion of medieval friar technology. But stay with me because this detail is the key to everything. The Mongol horse, as I mentioned earlier, was incredibly tough and could survive on minimal food. These ponies had evolved on the steppes of Mongolia, where the ground was mostly soft soil and grass. Their hooves were hard and durable, shaped by thousands of years of natural selection to handle that specific environment. Mongols didn't need horseshoes on the steppes. The soft ground actually helped toughen their hooves naturally. But here's the thing. Mongolia and Syria are very different places geologically. Syria is part of the Levantine region, and its terrain is characterized by rocky hills, limestone outcroppings, and hard-packed soil. When horses without shoes traverse this kind of terrain repeatedly, their hooves crack, chip, and become painfully bruised. A horse with damaged hooves moves more slowly, tires more quickly, and in severe cases becomes completely lame. The Mamluks, on the other hand, had been fighting in this region for generations. Their horses were sure. They had iron shoes nailed to their hooves that protected them from the rocky ground. This seemingly minor difference had enormous strategic implications. On the rocky terrain of Syria and Palestine, Mamluk horses could move faster, fight longer, and maneuver more effectively than Mongol ponies. But there was a second problem for the Mongols, and this one was even more fundamental: grass. Remember how I told you that a Mongol cavalryman might have 3 to 4 horses and that each horse needed about 9 lb of grass per day? Let's do the math. If Kituka had 15,000 Mongol cavalry and each had 3 horses, that's 45,000 horses. At 9 lb of grass each per day, that's over 400,000 lb of fodder needed daily. Those horses need about 8 square miles of good grassland to graze on. Mongolia is covered in grassland. It's literally called the Eurasian steppe. Grass for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Mongols could graze their massive horse herds easily. Syria is semi-arid. It has some grassland in certain areas, but not the endless seas of grass that the Mongols were accustomed to. Modern estimates suggest that the Syrian landscape could support maybe 80,000 horses total before overgrazing became a critical problem. And that's for horses that are just sitting around grazing, not fighting battles and making forced marches. This meant that the Mongols couldn't bring their normal, overwhelming numbers of horses to Syria. They couldn't use their standard strategy of switching to fresh mounts constantly. Their horses were working harder on tougher terrain with less food. And the Mamluks knew this. In fact, historical records indicate that the Mamluks had adopted a scorched earth strategy in some areas, burning grassland to deny it to the Mongols. It was medieval resource denial warfare, and it was brutally effective. Now let's talk about the terrain of the Jezreel Valley itself, because this is where geography becomes a weapon. The Jezreel Valley is a triangular plain in northern Israel stretching about 30 mi from Mount Carmel in the west to the Jordan River Valley in the east. It's a fertile area, and it's been the site of countless battles throughout history, precisely because it's a natural invasion route. If you're marching from Syria toward Egypt, you're going to pass through this valley. But here's what makes it special. While the valley floor is relatively flat and open, perfect cavalry country, the kind of terrain the Mongols loved. It's surrounded on all sides by hills and low mountains. Mount Gilboa rises to the south. The hills of Lower Galilee bound it to the north. Mount Tabor looms to the northeast. And these hills aren't bare windswept highlands. They're covered with trees and rocky outcroppings. The battle would take place near a spring called Ain Jalut, which means Goliath's spring in Arabic. Legend said this was where the biblical David had defeated Goliath thousands of years earlier. The spring sits at one of the narrowest points of the valley, where the hills close in from both sides. Baibars looked at this terrain and saw a possibility. The valley floor would draw the Mongols in. It was perfect ground for their cavalry tactics. But those surrounding hills with their trees and rocks could hide an army. And if the Mamluks could lure the Mongols into the valley and then attack from the hills, they could negate the Mongols' mobility advantage and force them to fight on ground that favored heavier cavalry and infantry. It was a plan that required perfect timing, iron discipline, and more than a little luck. But it was the only plan that gave them a chance. On the night of September 2nd, 1260, Kutus positioned the bulk of his army in the hills surrounding Ain Jalut, hidden among the trees and rocks. Barbars would take a small vanguard force, maybe a few thousand cavalry, and position them in the valley itself as bait. When the Mongols appeared, Barbars would engage them, provoke them, and then execute a feigned retreat, drawing them deeper into the valley toward the hills where Kutus waited with the main force. It was the Mongols' own favorite tactic turned against them. The student was about to teach the master a very painful lesson. If you're enjoying this story and you want to see what happens when historical homework meets Hollywood-level storytelling, do me a favor and drop a comment below. Tell me if you were waiting for the Mongol army with a tiny force while your main army hides in the hills. What would be going through your mind? Because that's the situation. He faced at dawn on September 3rd, 1260. The sun rose over the Jezreel Valley on that September morning, and Kitbuka's Mongol army approached from the north. The Mongol general was supremely confident. He had fought for decades alongside Hulagun. He had helped conquer Baghdad. He had seen Damascus surrender without a fight. He commanded battle-hardened veterans who had never been permanently defeated. When his scouts reported that a Mamluk force was blocking the valley ahead, Kitbuka probably smiled. Finally, the Egyptians were going to stand and fight instead of cowering behind their walls. This would be over quickly. Kitbuka's army included not just Mongols, but also auxiliary forces from the regions they had conquered. There were Armenian cavalry, Christian Georgian troops, and Syrian warriors. The Syrians were kept in reserve, though. Kitbuka didn't entirely trust them not to defect if the battle turned against him. Barbars watching from the valley floor, with his small vanguard force, must have felt his mouth go dry as the Mongol army deployed. Even knowing that Kutus was hidden in the hills with the main Mamluk force, even knowing that this was all part of the plan, seeing the Mongol army in battle formation must have been terrifying. The Mongols had arranged themselves in their standard formation. Light cavalry armed with composite bows formed the front ranks, ready to harass the enemy with arrows. Heavier cavalry waited behind, ready to exploit any opening. It was a formation they had used successfully for 50 years against every enemy they had faced. But Barbars had one advantage that Kitbuka didn't know about. Barbars had carefully positioned his forces so that the Mongols would be facing east into the rising sun. The morning light would be in their eyes, making it harder to see the Mamluk movements clearly. It's a small detail, but in the chaos of battle, small details compound into major advantages. The battle began with Bibars doing exactly what Kitbuka expected, charging forward with his cavalry to meet the Mongol advance. Arrows filled the air from both sides. Men and horses screamed. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. But Barbars wasn't trying to win this first engagement. He was trying to provoke the Mongols, to sting them, to make them angry. His cavalry would charge in, loose a volley of arrows, and then wheel away before the Mongols could close to melee range. It was classic hit-and-run harassment designed to frustrate and enrage. And it worked. For hours, Barbars' small force skirmished with the Mongols, darting in and out, never committing to a full engagement. The Mongols used two enemies, who either broke and ran immediately or stood and fought. To the death found this incredibly frustrating. They wanted a decisive engagement. They wanted to use their superior tactics and numbers to crush this annoying force once and for all. Kitbuka ordered a heavier assault. He sent more cavalry forward, pushing harder, trying to pin down Barbars' force and destroy it. The Mamluks fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and being pushed back. And then, exactly as planned, Bibars gave the signal, retreat. His cavalry turned and fled back down the valley toward the south, toward the hills where Kutus waited. To the Mongols, it looked exactly like what they expected. The Mamluks had put up a brave fight, but they were breaking under pressure. Now was the time to pursue, to destroy the fleeing enemy before they could regroup. Kitbuka ordered the pursuit. The Mongol cavalry, sensing victory, charged after the retreating Mamluks. This was what they were good at: the chase, the pursuit, the final destruction of a broken enemy. Their blood was up. They were eager for the kill. Barbars' cavalry fled down the valley, the Mongols close behind. The valley narrowed as they approached Ain Jalut, hills closing in from both sides. Trees and rocks dotted the slopes, but the Mongols barely noticed. Their eyes were fixed on the fleeing Mamluks ahead. On the hilltop, Kutus watched the Mongol army pour into the valley like water flowing into a bottle. This was the critical moment. If he sprang the trap too early, the Mongols could retreat out of the valley. If he waited too long, his vanguard would be destroyed, and the Mongols might realize they were riding into an ambush. He waited. The tension must have been unbearable. His officers were watching him, waiting for the signal. The Mongols were drawing closer to the hidden Mamluk positions in the hills. Closer, closer. Now, Kutus gave the order, and the hills erupted with warriors. From three sides, Mamluk cavalry and infantry poured out of their hiding places among the trees and rocks. War drums thundered. Battle cries in Arabic echoed off the valley walls. The Mongols stretched out in a long pursuit formation, suddenly found themselves surrounded. To their credit, the Mongols didn't panic. These were professional soldiers who had faced ambushes before. They tried to wheel around to form a defensive circle to use their discipline and training to fight their way out. But they were fighting uphill. Literally, the Mamluks were charging down from the hillsides, gravity adding to the force of their charge. The rocky ground that had been slowly wearing down the unsure hooves of the Mongol ponies now became a major liability. The horses stumbled on loose rocks. They slipped on the uneven terrain. Their damaged hooves made them slower and less maneuverable. Meanwhile, the Mamluk horses, protected by their iron shoes, charged down the rocky slopes without hesitation. The Mamluks unleashed a devastating arrow barrage from multiple directions. Mongol cavalry tried to respond with their own archery, but they were firing uphill, while under assault from three sides. And then the Mamluks employed a weapon that the Mongols had never encountered before: hand cannons. These early firearms, called midfay in Arabic, were crude by modern standards. They were essentially metal tubes filled with gunpowder that launched a projectile with a loud bang and a cloud of smoke. They weren't particularly accurate, and they didn't kill many Mongols directly, but that wasn't their purpose. The purpose was to terrify the horses. Mongol war horses were trained to remain calm in battle, to ignore the screams of wounded men and the clash of steel. But they had never heard anything like the explosive crack of gunpowder weapons. When the midfay fired, Mongol horses reared, bucked, and bolted. Riders were thrown. Formations broke apart. In the chaos, Mamluk heavy cavalry crashed into the disorganized Mongol ranks. Now the Mamluks, heavier horses and armor became decisive advantages in the close quarters melee that developed. The heavier Mammal cavalry could literally bowl over the lighter Mongol horsemen. Their armor absorbed blows that would have killed lighter armored Mongols. Their lances and swords, designed for close combat, were more effective in the press of the melee than the Mongol composite bows. The battle raged for hours. The Mongols, to their immense credit, fought with incredible ferocity. They managed to break through the Mamluk left flank, pushing back the Egyptian forces there and threatening to split the Mamluk army in two. This was the critical moment of the battle. If the Mongols could break through and escape the trap, they could reform and turn the battle around. They had done it before against other enemies. Sultan Kutus, watching from his position with the reserves, saw the danger, and he made a decision that shows why he was more than just a competent general. He was a leader who understood that sometimes you have to risk everything. He removed his helmet. In medieval warfare, generals wore distinctive helmets and armor so their troops could identify them in the chaos of battle. By removing his helmet, Kutus was making himself a target. He was also making sure every one of his soldiers could see his face. Then he rode directly into the most dangerous part of the battle, into the gap where the Mongols were breaking through. His bodyguards tried to stop him, but he spurred his horse forward, and as he rode, he shouted a cry that chroniclers recorded: "O soldiers of Islam, O defenders of the faith." The effect was electric. Seeing their sultan bareheaded and vulnerable, charging into the thick of the fight, the Mamluk soldiers rallied. The wavering left flank held. Fresh troops poured into the gap. The Mongol breakthrough stalled, then was pushed back. And then something happened that Kituka had feared from the beginning. The Syrian auxiliaries in his army defected. These were men who had been forced to fight for the Mongols after their cities had been conquered. They had no love for their Mongol overlords. They had only fought because resistance seemed hopeless. But now, seeing the Mongols surrounded and on the defensive for the first time in their lives, the Syrians saw their chance. They turned their weapons on the Mongols and joined the Mamluk side. The Mongol army, already hard-pressed, now found itself fighting enemies in its own ranks. The situation became desperate. Kibuka, the Mongol general, must have known at this point that the battle was lost. Chroniclers say that some of his officers urged him to flee, to escape and live to fight another day. But Kituka refused. He had served Hulagukan faithfully for years. He had helped conquer an empire. He would not die running. He continued fighting even as the Mongol army disintegrated around him. An arrow struck his horse and the animal collapsed. Kitbuka fell to the ground, and Mamluk soldiers immediately surrounded him. There are different accounts of what happened next. Some sources say he died fighting, sword in hand, taking several Mamluks with him. Others say he was captured alive and brought before Kutus. According to the Persian historian Rashid Alin, when the captured Kibuka was brought before Kutus, the Sultan said, "You have shed so much blood wrongfully, ended the lives of champions and dignitaries, and overthrown ancient dynasties. Now you have finally fallen into a snare yourself." Kitbuka's response shows the absolute confidence that had sustained the Mongols through decades of conquest. "Even defeated, even captured," he replied, "if I am killed by your hand, I consider it to be God's act, not yours. Be not deceived by this event for one moment, for when the news of my death reaches Hulagan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over, and from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will quake with the hooves of Mongol horses." It was a threat and a prophecy, and then they beheaded him on the battlefield. With their general dead, the Mongol army broke entirely. Those who could flee did so, racing back north toward the town of Bazan, 8 miles away. The Mamluks pursued them relentlessly, and this is where the rocky terrain that had hindered the Mongols during the battle became absolutely devastating during the retreat. Fleeing cavalry on tired horses with damaged hoops, trying to escape across rocky, unfamiliar terrain while pursued by fresh mammal cavalry on shod horses. It was a slaughter. The Mongols rallied briefly at Basin and tried to make a stand, but they were overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the Mongol army that had conquered from Baghdad to Damascus had been effectively destroyed. Thousands of Mongol warriors lay dead in the valley. For the first time in over 50 years, a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle and would never return to avenge the loss. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Kutus did something that he knew would send a message across the medieval world. He had Kibuka's head placed on a spear and sent it to Cairo, where it was displayed on the Bobzua gate for all to see. Think about the symbolism here. Just months earlier, Kutus had executed the Mongol envoys and displayed their heads on this same gate. The Mongols had sent their armies in response, supremely confident that Egypt would fall like every other kingdom that had resisted them. Instead, the head of their general was now mounted on the same gate, a grim answer to Hulagukan's threats. The news of a Jalut spread across the medieval world like wildfire. In Cairo, there were celebrations in the streets. In Baghdad's ruins, in Damascus, in Aleppo, everywhere the Mongols had conquered. People began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the Mongols weren't invincible after all. The Mamluks didn't stop at defense. Within days of the battle, they marched north and recaptured Damascus. Within a month, they had retaken Aleppo. Syria, which had been under Mongol control for only a few months, returned to Muslim hands. The Mamluk Sultanate would go on to rule Egypt and the Levant for over 250 years. But here's where the story takes an ironic and dark turn. On the march back to Cairo, flushed with victory, Sultan Kutus made a fatal mistake. He had promised Baybars, the general who had devised and executed the brilliant ambush strategy, that he would be rewarded with Syria as his own domain to govern. But Kutus either changed his mind or asked Baybars to wait. We don't know exactly what was said. What we do know is that Baybars, the ambitious and ruthless general who had just helped save the Islamic world, formed a conspiracy with other Mamluk officers. On October 24, 1260, Less than 2 months after the great victory at Ain Jalut, Barbars and his co-conspirators murdered Kutus during a hunting expedition. They claimed the killing was justified because Kutus had failed to honor his promises. But let's be honest about what this was. It was an assassination driven by ambition and greed. Barbars then declared himself the new Sultan of Egypt. And you know what? He turned out to be pretty good at it. Under his rule, the Mamluks would complete the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land, capturing Acre in 1291 and ending 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant. He would defeat subsequent Mongol attempts to invade Syria. He would make the Mamluk sultanate into the dominant power in the Middle East for generations. But I can't help but think about Kutus. Here was a man who had been enslaved by the Mongols, who had worked his way up through the Mamluk system, who had made the brave decision to fight rather than surrender, who had risked everything to face an enemy that seemed invincible. He won the battle that saved Islamic civilization in the Middle East and North Africa, and his reward was to be murdered by his own subordinate. History is messy like that. It doesn't always give us the neat, morally satisfying endings we crave. Cutout deserved to be remembered as a hero, but he was dead within weeks of his greatest triumph, killed by the man he had elevated and trusted. Meanwhile, in Azerbaijan, Hulagu Khan received news of the disaster at Ain Jalut. True to Kabuka's prophecy, he was furious. He immediately began planning a massive invasion to avenge the defeat and crush Egypt once and for all. But he never got the chance. Remember I mentioned Burkan, the ruler of the Golden Horde in Russia? Burk had converted to Islam, and he was absolutely horrified by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the Caliph. He viewed it as an unforgivable crime against the Islamic faith. Moreover, Burki believed that Hulagu had taken territory in the Caucasus that rightfully belonged to the Golden Horde. So, Burki did something unprecedented in Mongol history. He allied with the Mamluks against a fellow Mongol ruler and declared war on Hulagu. This was a civil war within the Mongol Empire. Mongol versus Mongol. In 1263, Hulagu led an army north to face Burk. The 2 Mongol forces clashed in the Caucasus, and Hulagu suffered a significant defeat. He would spend the rest of his life fighting Burk's forces in the north rather than invading Egypt in the south. He died in 1265, his dream of conquering Egypt unfulfilled. His successors made a few attempts to retake Syria. In 1300, Mongol forces briefly occupied Damascus again, but they couldn't hold it. The reasons were the same reasons they had lost at Ain Jalut. Not enough grassland to support their horses, terrain that didn't favor their tactics, and Mamluk defenders who understood how to exploit these weaknesses. By 1303, after the Mamluks defeated another Mongol invasion at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, the Mongols essentially gave up on conquering Egypt and the Levant. Jalut had marked the high watermark of Mongol expansion westward, and they would never cross that line again. So let's talk about what Jalut means in the grand sweep of history, because this battle had consequences that rippled far beyond the Middle East. If the Mongols had won at Ain Jalut and gone on to conquer Egypt, the entire history of the Mediterranean world would have been different. With Egypt under Mongol control, they would have had a base to invade North Africa. The Mongols had already reached Poland in the north. A Mongol empire stretching from Poland to Morocco would have held Europe in a giant pincer. Would the Italian Renaissance have happened if Mongol armies were threatening from both the east and the south? Would the age of European exploration and colonization have occurred if European kingdoms were fighting for survival against Mongol invasions? Would Islam have survived as a major world religion if its last major power center had been destroyed? These are counterfactual questions, and we can never know for sure. But it's worth contemplating just how different our world might have been if Baibars hadn't known the terrain of the Jezreel Valley, if Mamluk horses hadn't been sure, if Syria had more grassland, if the hills around Ain Jalut hadn't provided perfect cover for an ambush. The battle also demonstrates something that I think is crucial for understanding military history. Tactics and bravery matter, but geography and logistics often matter more. The Mongols didn't lose at Ain Jalut because they were bad soldiers. They were excellent soldiers. They didn't lose because they were cowards or incompetent. They were brave and well-led. They lost because their entire system of warfare was optimized for a specific environment, the Eurasian steppe. And when they moved into a different environment, the advantages that had made them invincible became liabilities. Their small, tough, unsure ponies that could survive anywhere on the steppes couldn't handle rocky terrain as well as shore horses. Their strategy of bringing huge numbers of remounts couldn't work in a land without enough grass. Their mobility advantage was negated by hills and trees. It's a lesson that military planners have had to relearn throughout history. The tactics that work brilliantly in one environment can fail catastrophically in another. The British learned this in the American Revolution when their European-style formations met guerrilla warfare in the forests of North America. The Americans learned this in Vietnam when their overwhelming firepower met an enemy who controlled the jungle. The Soviets learned this in Afghanistan when their mechanized army met mountain fighters who knew every pass and valley. The Mongols were the greatest military force of their age, but they weren't magic. They weren't unstoppable. They were human beings using tactics adapted to their homeland. And when they encountered an enemy who understood both their tactics and the terrain better than they did, they could be beaten. There's something else I want to point out, something that I think is fascinating from a historical perspective. The Mamluks wanted Ain Jalut by using the Mongols' own tactics against them. The feigned retreat, the ambush, the exploitation of overconfidence. These were all tactics the Mongols had used successfully for decades. Barbars, as a Turk from the Central Asian steppes, would have grown up hearing stories about Mongol tactics. He understood how they fought because he came from the same martial tradition. This wasn't East versus West or Christianity versus Islam or any of the other simplistic frameworks we sometimes use to understand medieval conflicts. This was steppe warrior versus steppe warrior, with the crucial difference being that one side knew the local terrain and the other didn't. I also think it's worth reflecting on the role of luck and timing in history. If Mongol Khan hadn't died in 1259, Hulagu might never have left Syria. If he had stayed with his full army of over 100,000 men, the Mamluks would have been outnumbered 5-1. And terrain advantage or not, they probably would have lost. If Birkan hadn't converted to Islam and allied with the Mamluks against Hulagu, the Mongols might have been able to concentrate their forces and try again. History is full of these contingent moments where a death, a decision, an alliance changes everything. We like to tell stories with clear causes and effects, with heroes and villains and inevitable outcomes. But the truth is often messier and more dependent on chance than we'd like to admit. That said, I don't want to discount the courage and skill of the Mamluk warriors who fought at Ain Jalut. They were facing an enemy with a terrifying reputation, an enemy that had destroyed every kingdom that had resisted it. They knew that if they lost, Cairo would probably suffer the same fate as Baghdad, total destruction. They fought with everything they had, and they won because they combined courage with intelligence, bravery with strategy. And Qutuz, for all that his story ended badly, deserves recognition for making the gutsy call to fight rather than surrender. It would have been easy to rationalize submission. The Mongols had offered to let him keep his throne as a vassal. He could have said he was saving Egyptian lives by avoiding a battle, but he chose to fight. And that choice preserved Islamic civilization in the Middle East. Today, if you visit the site of the Battle of Ain Jalut, you'll find agricultural fields in the Mayan Harad National Park in northern Israel. There's no grand monument, no tourist center with gift shops and audio guides. The exact location of the battle is actually somewhat uncertain, clears throat, because medieval chroniclers weren't great at recording precise coordinates. But the spring is still there. The hills still surround the valley, and if you stand on the slopes of Mount Gilboa and look out over the Jezreel Valley, you can imagine what Qutuz saw on that September morning in 1260. valley floor that would tempt any cavalry general, hills perfect for an ambush, and the approach of an army that thought it was invincible. The story of Ain Jalut is a reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, has limits. Those limits might be geographical, logistical, or political, but they exist. The Mongol Empire, which stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, found its western limit in a rocky valley in northern Palestine, where their horses' hooves met ground they weren't adapted for. It's also a reminder that knowledge of local conditions can be just as important as superior numbers or better weapons. Barbars knew the terrain. He knew where to hide an army, where to spring an ambush, how to exploit the weaknesses that the rocky ground would create for unsure horses. That local knowledge, combined with the courage to use it, made all the difference. And perhaps most importantly, Jalut reminds us that history is made by choices. Kutus chose to fight rather than surrender. Barbars chose to devise a risky ambush rather than meet the Mongols in open battle. Kitbuka chose to pursue the retreating Mamluks rather than suspecting a trap. Each of these choices had consequences that rippled through history. Before I wrap this up, I want to know what you think in the comments below. Tell me, do you think Kutuz's assassination by Barbars was justified, or was it a betrayal of a hero? Do you think the Mongols could have conquered Europe if they had beaten the Mamluks at what other battles in history do you think deserve this kind of deep dive? Your comments actually help me figure out what to cover next, so don't be shy. If you enjoyed this video, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button. Clears throat. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. Second, subscribe and ring that notification bell because I've got more stories like this coming about the battles, the technologies, and the weird geographical quirks that changed the course of history. And third, share this video with someone who loves history because stories like this are too good to keep to yourself. Remember, the secret that crushed the Mongols wasn't a superweapon or a miracle. It was horseshoes, grass, and rocky hills. It was local knowledge used brilliantly. It was an understanding that the ground beneath your feet can be just as important as the sword in your hand. The Mongols conquered the largest land empire in history, but they learned at Ain Jalut that there's always ground where even the greatest army can't tread. Sometimes terrain is destiny. And on September 3rd, 1260, the terrain of the Jezreel Valley decided the fate of civilizations. Thanks for watching.